October 17, 1878. The finality of the date pressed down on Abram Finch with the weight of a gravestone. His landlord, a man named Patterson whose kindness evaporated with his profits, stood by the empty corral, his arms crossed. The dust, stirred by the man's impatient boot, settled on the carcass of the second ox, a creature named Bright who had pulled Abram's plough for 6 seasons. Patterson did not look at the animal. He looked at the ledger in his mind. The agreement was for 2 oxen, Finch. Not 1 inch. Abram said nothing. There was nothing to say. The blight had taken Bright in 3 days, a swift and merciless fever that left the animal a husk. His other ox, Buck, stood alone, looking smaller and more vulnerable than ever before. Abram's inventory of worldly goods was brutally short: 1 aging ox, a plough with a worn share, an axe, a shovel, a single cast iron pot, a wool blanket, and a small, precious canvas sack holding 40 pounds of seed corn from his last meager harvest. This corn was the ghost of his wife, Martha, who had insisted they save the best kernels from the strongest stalks, a practice she'd called a prayer for next year. Patterson gestured vaguely toward the west, toward the unforgiving spine of low, rocky hills that no one else wanted. You can take your chances on the unclaimed section. The county won't bother you there. But you're done here. He wasn't cruel, merely practical. A 1-ox man couldn't work a full plot. A 1-ox man was a liability. Abram loaded his few possessions onto a crude drag sled he'd built years ago. He tied the rope to Buck's yoke, and the solitary animal strained, pulling the scant evidence of a life across the parched earth. He did not look back. The cabin he had shared with Martha, the small field they had cleared together, the memory of her laughter carried on the summer air, all of it now belonged to the ledger. He walked for 2 days, climbing into the broken country where the soil was thin and limestone bones broke through the surface. He was looking for one thing: water. On the 3rd morning, he found it. Not a creek, but a seep, a place where moisture wept from a fissure in the rock, feeding a patch of stubborn green grass. It was enough. He would dig a well there. As he scouted the area for a place to build a shelter, he nearly fell. The ground simply gave way under his foot. He stumbled back, his heart hammering. It wasn't a snake hole. It was a sinkhole, a narrow, collapsed throat in the earth, partially obscured by a thicket of scrub oak. He fetched his shovel and a length of rope, clearing the brush and peering down. The opening was about 4 feet across, and the darkness smelled of cool, dry dust and ancient stone, not of dampness or decay. He lit a twist of wool-soaked rag and lowered it on the rope. The flame burned steady, revealing not a cave, but a chamber, a natural bell-shaped room in the limestone. It was perhaps 12 feet deep, and widened to 8 or 10 feet across at its base. The air that rose from it was cold, a full 20 degrees cooler than the blistering afternoon. An idea, quiet and strange, began to form. It was not a home for him. It was a pantry for the earth itself. He looked at his sack of seed corn, the legacy of Martha's hope. He would not just build a cabin. He would build a vault. The work was brutal, a solitary battle against geology and gravity. Abram's only companion was Buck, whose soft, ruminant breaths were a comfort in the lonely dawns. He began by widening the entrance to the limestone chamber, using his pickaxe to chip away at the rock until the opening was large enough to lower himself and a bucket without scraping his ribs raw. The sound of steel on stone was a sharp, percussive rhythm that marked the passing of his days. He spent the first week just clearing the floor of the chamber, hauling up bucket after bucket of loose rock and ancient, bone-dry soil. The tools were simple: a shovel whose handle was worn smooth as glass, a heavy iron pickaxe, 2 wooden buckets, and 100 feet of hemp rope. He rigged a simple pulley from the limb of a sturdy oak that grew near the sinkhole, allowing him to haul the debris out with Buck's steady, plodding strength. Once the floor was clear, he saw the chamber's true potential. The walls were solid, dry limestone, a material that seemed to drink the heat from the air. Even at midday, when the sun baked the land outside to a pale, shimmering sheet, the air inside remained profoundly cool and still. He had a quiet, unshakable thought, a vow made to the memory of his wife and the precious sack of corn. Here. This will be the heart of it. He started building his cabin directly over the hole. He laid a foundation of the flat, heavy stones he'd hauled from the chamber, creating a low wall upon which he would build his simple log structure. But in the center of the floor, he framed a section differently. He built a heavy, double-planked trapdoor, reinforced with hand-forged iron hinges he traded for with a traveling blacksmith, giving the man a portion of his dried meat. The door was flush with the rest of the floorboards, its edges so carefully beveled that, once covered by a bearskin rug, it would be invisible. The labor transformed him. The fat of easier years melted away, leaving a man made of wire and gristle. His hands became landscapes of callus and scar. He worked from before sunrise until the last light failed, driven by a purpose that felt more profound than mere survival. He was not just building a shelter, he was creating a sanctuary. He was crafting a place immune to the fickle cruelties of the world above, the scorching sun that could wither a crop, the sudden rains that could bring rot, and the insidious pests that could turn a bin of golden grain into a worthless pile of dust and husks. The world above was chaos. The world below would be order. His quiet vow echoed with every swing of the axe, every lift of a stone. This place would keep what he gave it, safe and unchanged, a fortress of cold, silent stone against the ravages of time. He was building a memory box for the future. By the time the first snows of winter dusted the high ridges, Abram's cabin was complete. It was a small, tight structure, just one room, with a stone fireplace that drew well and a roof of split cedar shakes that smelled of resin and rain. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from any other lonely homestead clinging to the edge of the territories. But its true innovation was hidden beneath the floor. He spent that first winter not in idleness, but in refinement. He lined the stone walls of the subterranean chamber with carefully fitted, flat rocks, mortaring them with a mix of clay and sand to seal any small fissures. He built low, wide shelves of slate raised off the floor on stone footings. His routine was monastic. Each morning, he would check the temperature in the chamber, lowering a small thermometer on a string. It never varied by more than a few degrees, holding steady in the low 50s, regardless of the howling blizzards or frozen stillness outside. He conducted a small experiment. He placed a cup of water in the chamber and another in his cabin. The water in the cabin froze solid overnight. The water below remained liquid, a thin skim of ice forming only on the coldest nights. He was creating a zone of stability, a pocket of persistence. When spring arrived, he planted his corn. He worked his small, rocky plot with a feverish intensity, knowing that his entire future depended on this single harvest. The soil was thin, and he amended it with leaf mold and ash from his fire, tending each stalk as if it were a child. His trips to the settlement of Prairie Dog Creek for supplies were infrequent, but they were enough to seed the first whispers of curiosity, which soon curdled into mockery. Men gathered at Miller's Mercantile saw him buying not tools or traps, but more rope and another iron pulley wheel. A farmer named Graves, a man whose prosperity was as loud as his voice, clapped him on the shoulder. "Heard you're digging to China, Finch. Find any gold down there?" The other men chuckled. Abram just shook his head. Just stone another time, Miller, the storekeeper, asked him what he was building. Abram, a man of few words, replied simply, "A root cellar," but the scale of his digging, evidenced by the large mound of excavated rock and earth behind his cabin, suggested something more. The story grew in the telling. Finch wasn't building a cellar, he was building a bunker, a tomb. He was a man addled by grief and loneliness, digging his own grave. The children of the settlement had a new name for him, Mole Man. They would sometimes ride their ponies out to the edge of his property and watch him work, chanting the name until he turned his steady, quiet gaze on them, and they would scatter like quail. Abram heard the jokes. He felt the weight of their judgment. But it did not touch him. Their world was horizontal, spread out across dusty acres under a vast, indifferent sky. His was becoming vertical, a column of purpose connecting the uncertain surface with the stable, quiet dark. Security was not a high wall, but a low roof, buried deep in the patient heart of the earth. The summer was a good one, with timely rains and a sun that was strong but not scorching. The corn grew tall, the stalks thick and heavy with ears. Abram harvested it with a meticulous care that bordered on reverence, shucking each ear by hand in the evenings by the light of his fire. He built drying racks in his cabin, where the ears could cure in the warm, dry air from the hearth. He knew that moisture was the enemy, the precursor to rot and mold. Only when the kernels were as hard and dry as pebbles did he begin the process of storing them. One morning in late October, he awoke to a world transformed. A blue norther had descended overnight, a tidal wave of Arctic air that plunged temperatures by 50 degrees in a matter of hours. The sky was the color of lead, and a wind sharp as a razor scoured the land. A quarter of his harvest, the last of it, was still on the outdoor racks, not yet fully cured. He worked frantically, hauling the racks inside, but it was too late. The moisture inside the kernels of the uncured corn had frozen, splitting them and turning them to a mushy, useless mass when they thawed. He lost nearly 100 pounds of grain. It was a brutal setback, a punishment for his small miscalculation. He felt a cold knot of grief in his stomach, not just for the lost food, but for the failure. He had come so close to perfect preservation. He stood over the ruined corn, the sweet, sad smell of its decay filling his small cabin. He did not curse or rage. The land did not care for his emotions. It responded only to preparation and respect. He spent no more than 5 minutes contemplating the loss. Then, he methodically separated the ruined corn, hauling it out to the woods for the deer and squirrels. Grief was a luxury, problem-solving was survival. The loss taught him a vital lesson. The system wasn't complete. The chamber could keep the grain safe, but only if it was perfectly prepared before it entered. His cabin was too small to dry a full harvest quickly and efficiently. He needed to expand the operation. He went back to work, not with despair, but with a renewed, cold focus. He used the stones he had excavated to build a small, low-walled structure adjoining his cabin, a dedicated drying shed. He designed a new kind of rack system, made of wire mesh he purchased from Miller, which allowed for better air circulation. He channeled heat from the back of his fireplace through a crude stone flue that ran under the floor of the drying shed, creating a gentle, constant warmth. The other settlers saw his new construction and the mockery found fresh fuel. "Finch is building a palace for his corn now," Graves announced at the Mercantile. An outhouse for his vegetables, Abram ignored them. He was no longer building for their approval. He was in a silent dialogue with the seasons, learning the unforgiving grammar of heat and cold, moisture and dryness. The lost corn was a painful but necessary teacher. It had revealed a weakness in his thinking, and now he was making it a strength. The earth taught slowly, but its lessons were permanent. The following year, his system was complete. The harvest was not as bountiful as the last, a dry spell in August having stunted some of the stalks, but what he gathered, he preserved perfectly. The new drying shed worked flawlessly. The corn went into the subterranean chamber bone dry, the kernels like amber beads, each one a tiny, sleeping promise. He filled 3 large oak barrels and sealed them, their contents safe in the cool, silent dark. For his own use, he kept several large sacks, drawing from them as needed. He found that the corn, kept in this stable environment, retained a sweetness and texture that was usually lost by midwinter. The flour he ground from it was finer, the bread richer. He had not just prevented decay, he had arrested time. That spring, for the first time, he had a true surplus. He loaded one of the sealed barrels onto his drag sled and had Buck pull it the half-day journey to Prairie Dog Creek. He hauled it into Miller's Mercantile. Miller pried the lid off, expecting to see the usual late-season grain, a little dusty, a few weevil holes, maybe the faint smell of dampness. Instead, he plunged his hand into a cascade of pristine, perfect kernels. They were hard, clean, and cool to the touch. He sifted them through his fingers, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise, and then to genuine respect. He brought a handful to his nose. It smelled of nothing but clean corn. "Abram," he said, his voice low. "I've never seen kernels so hard in late spring. There's not a single weevil track on them. What's your secret?" Abram looked at the storekeeper, a man who had tolerated the jokes made at his expense. "Good soil," he said. "And a dry place to keep it." The answer was true, but it was a truth that hid a deeper one. Miller paid him a premium, 20% above the going rate, and didn't haggle. "Whatever you're doing, Finch, keep doing it. I'll buy all you can spare next year." The transaction did not go unnoticed. Graves, who was in the store buying salt, watched the exchange with a narrowed gaze. He saw the quality of the corn and the weight of the coin purse Miller handed to Abram. The laughter had stopped. A grudging curiosity was taking its place. Abram used the money to buy a few things he had long done without: a new axe head, glass for his cabin's window, and a small, brass-cased magnifying glass. It was an indulgence, but one with a purpose. He wanted to understand the enemy. He returned to his homestead with more than just supplies. He carried with him the first, faint glimmer of a change in his standing. He was no longer just the eccentric Finch, the mole man. He was the man who grew the best corn in the county. His solitude had been a subject of ridicule, but the fruits of that solitude were now a subject of commerce, and in a place like this, commerce was the surest path to respect. That evening, Abram sat at his small table and conducted an investigation. He had asked Miller for a scoop of the common grain from the store's main bin, the very grain Graves and the others would be using for their own seed. He poured a small pile of it onto a white plate and placed it beside a pile of his own corn. To the naked eye, the difference was noticeable but not dramatic. Miller's corn was duller, with a fine coating of pale dust. A few kernels were visibly cracked or had tiny, dark holes in them. His own corn looked polished, almost alive with a deep, golden luster. But the true revelation came under the lens of the new magnifying glass. He leaned over Miller's corn, adjusting the focus. The dust, he saw, was not dust at all. It was a mixture of fine, chewed grain and the desiccated husks of insect eggs. The tiny holes were boreholes, the work of the granary weevil. He found a few of the culprits themselves, tiny, dark beetles, no bigger than a pinhead, moving sluggishly among the kernels. He then turned the glass on his own corn. He scanned kernel after kernel. The surfaces were smooth, unbroken, perfect. There was no dust. There were no holes. There were no insects. He sat back, a feeling of quiet, profound awe washing over him. He finally understood. He had seen weevils before, of course. Every farmer had. They were a plague, a tax levied by nature. But he had always thought of them as an external threat, something that got into the grain. Now he realized the truth was more insidious. The eggs were already there, laid in the field on the growing corn, invisible parasites waiting for the right conditions. And the condition was warmth. His subterranean chamber did not kill the weevils. It did not magically purify the grain. It did something far more elegant. The constant, deep earth cold kept the temperature below the threshold needed for the eggs to hatch. The insects simply never woke up. They remained dormant, locked in a state of suspended animation. "The cold keeps them sleeping," he whispered to the empty room. It was a principle of the earth, as simple and as powerful as water freezing to ice. The planet keeps its own council, and its own temperature. He had, by accident and instinct, created a perfect hibernation chamber. This new understanding spurred a new round of construction. He refined the ventilation, creating 2 narrow shafts at opposite ends of the chamber that reached the surface. He fashioned tight-fitting stone plugs for them. In the winter, he could open the shafts on the coldest nights, drawing in dense, Arctic air to chill the chamber even further, then seal it in. He was no longer just using the Earth's passive coolness, he was actively managing it, turning his cellar into a precisely calibrated instrument. He felt a connection to his work he had never felt before, a sense of partnership with the stone, the cold, and the quiet, sleeping life within his charge. He was not a farmer anymore. He was a custodian. The next year, word of Finch's premium corn had spread. Farmers from neighboring valleys started making the trip to his homestead, not just to the mercantile, hoping to buy his seed corn directly. They would arrive, loud and dusty, and Abram would meet them with his usual quiet reserve. He sold what he could spare, never charging more than a fair price. The men who had once called him Mole Man now called him Mr. Finch. They saw his meticulously clean cabin, his well-tended field, and the strange, low-drying shed, and their mockery was replaced by a puzzled respect. They still didn't understand what he was doing, but they could no longer deny the results. One afternoon in early summer, he had a different kind of visitor. Not a farmer, but a woman leading a single mule laden with books. She introduced herself as Anneliese Schmidt, the new school teacher for Prairie Dog Creek. She was a widow, her husband having been a geologist for the railroad before he died of a fever. She was tall and slender, with intelligent eyes that miss nothing. She had come, she explained, because she needed to purchase seed for a small school garden, and she had heard his was the best. "Mr. Miller says your corn is untouched by the world," she said, a faint, curious smile on her face. I was intrigued. Abram measured out her corn, but as he did, she asked questions no one else had. She didn't ask how much land he worked or how many bushels he yielded. She asked about the soil, about the water from the seep, about the type of stone he'd excavated. Her curiosity was genuine, intellectual. He found himself answering in more than monosyllables. He felt an unfamiliar ease in her presence. Finally, looking at the neatly organized tools by his cabin door and the strange stone plugs lying near the foundation, she asked the question directly. "You have a secret, Mr. Finch. It is not just good soil, is it?" He looked at her for a long moment, at her clear, direct gaze. He saw not the prying curiosity of his neighbors, but the shared spirit of an investigator. He made a decision. "No," he said. "It is not." He walked to the center of his cabin, rolled back the bearskin rug, and lifted the heavy trapdoor. A plume of cool, dry air rose to meet them. He lit a lantern and gestured down the stone steps he had carved. "The secret is down here." Anneliese did not hesitate. She gathered her skirts and descended into the earth. She took in the stone-lined walls, the slate shelves, the sealed barrels. She ran her hand over the cold, dry stone. She looked at the whole system not with a farmer's eye for capacity, but with a scholar's eye for principle. She looked back up at him, her face illuminated by the lantern glow. "It's a principle of the earth," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder that mirrored his own. "The deep cold. You are using the planet's own constancy to create a zone of perfect preservation." It's beautiful. In that moment, Abram Finch, a man who had been profoundly alone for years, felt the warmth of being truly, completely understood. Anneliese became a regular visitor to the homestead. She would ride out on Saturday afternoons, bringing a book to read or a loaf of bread she had baked. She was fascinated by his system, and he was fascinated by her mind. She brought an order to his life he hadn't realized he was missing. She helped him create a ledger to track his yields and sales. She read to him in the evenings from her geology books, and he learned the names of the stones he lived with: limestone, shale, granite. He, in turn, taught her the rhythms of the land, the language of the clouds, the habits of the hawks that circled overhead. Their conversations were quiet, practical, and deeply intimate. She never pitied his solitude, she respected his self-sufficiency. He never saw her as a lonely widow, he saw her as a brilliant mind. One day, she arrived to find him struggling with a heavy barrel, his pulley system straining. "The geometry is wrong, Abram," she said, matter-of-factly. She picked up a piece of charcoal and, on the smooth surface of a flat rock, sketched out a new design, a compound pulley system that would halve the effort needed. Together, they built it. The work was easy, their movements falling into a natural, unspoken rhythm. As they hoisted the first barrel with the new rig, its weight lifting with astonishing ease, Abram laughed. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound in the quiet clearing. Anneliese smiled. "A place for everything, even your thoughts, Mr. Finch." And sometimes a simple machine to give them a lift. Their life together took on a comfortable shape. She did not move in, not at first, but his cabin became her second home. Her books found a place on a shelf he built for them. A second chair appeared by the fire. The space, once just a shelter for a solitary man, began to feel like a home. One evening, as they sat outside watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky, a comfortable silence settled between them. The air was cool, and Abram could feel the faint, steady breath of cold air rising from the stone plugs of his cellar's ventilation shafts. He turned to her. "This place," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It is a better place with you in it. The work is better. The quiet is better." He paused, searching for the right words he hadn't used in a decade. "I believe I would be a better man if you would consent to stay." Annalise looked at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. She did not offer a grand, romantic speech. Her reply was as practical and as heartfelt as his proposal. "I believe," she said softly, "that I am already home." The third summer of Abram's success was the driest in memory. The sun baked the plains to the color of old bone, and the creeks dwindled to trickles. The corn crop across the territory was stunted and meager. But worse was to come. The heat and drought created the perfect conditions for the granary weevils. They exploded in a silent, devastating plague. The infestation was discovered slowly at first. A farmer would open a sack of seed corn for early autumn planting and find it hollowed out, a mass of dust and crawling insects. The news spread like a prairie fire. Panic set in. Men converged on Miller's mercantile, hauling in their sacks and barrels, only to have their worst fears confirmed. Their entire stock of seed corn, the essential promise of the following year's survival, was gone. It had been devoured from the inside out. The store became a theater of despair. Abram watched as a crowd of 20, then 30 men, many of whom had mocked him, stood with ashen faces, their hands full of worthless, dusty husks. Graves, the loudest of his former critics, slammed a fistful of ruined grain on the counter. "It's all gone, Miller. Everything." Miller could only shake his head. "Mine too." The whole lot of it. The room fell into a heavy, hopeless silence. The entire community was facing a winter of hunger and a spring with nothing to plant. Into this silence, Abram spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the despair. "I have corn," he said. Every eye in the room turned to him. "It is clean. I have enough for myself, and I have a surplus. It should be enough for all of you, if we are careful." A man in the crowd asked, his voice cracking, "What's your price, Finch?" "You could name any price you want right now." Abram looked at the faces around him, at the fear and desperation. He saw not a chance for profit, but a community on the brink. He thought of Annalise and the home they were building. "The price," he said, "is what Miller paid me last spring. Not a penny more. Annalise will help me. We will make a list. Each family gets enough to plant their main field. No more, no less, until everyone has their share." The next day, a line of men on horseback formed on the trail to Abram's homestead. They were quiet, humbled. Abram and Annalise worked from dawn until dusk, measuring out the precious, perfect corn from the cool darkness of the cellar. Late in the afternoon, Graves approached, his hat in his hands. He stood before Abram, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Finch," he began, his voice thick. We were wrong. We called you a mole. Laughed at you for digging in the dirt." He looked up, his eyes meeting Abram's. "Turns out the mole saw the storm coming long before the rest of us looked up at the sky. We'd be grateful if you'd let us buy our share." Abram dipped a scoop into a sack of shimmering, golden corn and poured it into Graves's empty sack. "The earth holds what you give it," he said, his voice even. "That's all this is." The story of Finch's folly, as it had been called, became the story of Finch's foresight. His subterranean silo was no longer a subject of ridicule but of intense interest. In the spring of 1883, a man from the Territorial Agricultural College arrived, a professor named Alistair Reed. He had heard the story of the community saved by one man's strange cellar and had come to investigate. Reed was a man of science, carrying a satchel of instruments, thermometers, hygrometers for measuring humidity, and jars for collecting samples. Annalise, with her scientific background, was delighted, and the two of them spent a day with Abram, taking meticulous measurements. Reed was astonished. He recorded the temperature differential between the surface and the chamber, a staggering 40 degrees on that hot May afternoon. He documented the stable humidity, the lack of pests, the flawless condition of corn that was now almost 3 years old. He took pages of notes, sketching the cabin, the drying shed, and the cellar itself. "Mr. Finch," Reed said, shaking his head in admiration as they sat outside the cabin that evening, What you have built here is not just a cellar. It is a near-perfect system of passive refrigeration and pest control. Men at my university are writing papers about theories you have put into practice with nothing but stone and common sense. This should be the model for every granary on the plains. Abram, who was now married to Annalise, simply nodded. He felt no particular pride, only a quiet satisfaction. It seemed the sensible thing to do, he said. The ground is cooler than the air. I just put the corn where it was cold. Reed published his findings in a monograph titled Subterranean Food Preservation on the American Prairie, the Finch Method. The paper was widely read, and over the next decade, farmers throughout the territory began to build their own deep, stone-lined cellars, changing the way grain was stored forever. Abram and Annalise lived out their days on the homestead. They never grew wealthy, but they were never hungry. Their cabin became a quiet landmark, a place people pointed to as a testament to ingenuity. Years passed. The world above changed. The settlement of Prairie Dog Creek grew into a town with a railroad spur and a telegraph office. But beneath the small cabin, the stone chamber remained. It was a place outside of time, forever cool, dark, and silent. Long after Abram and Annalise were laid to rest on the hill overlooking the Seep, their great-grandchildren would still lift the heavy trapdoor on the hottest day of August. They would descend the worn stone steps and feel the profound, unchanging cold rise up to meet them, the cool, steady breath of the earth, holding safe what it had been given.